just want to say thanks again for all of you that serve people in different ways. That kind of really fits in with what we were talking about last week as well. And we'll just do a little bit of quick review as well. Just to give you some context, if you're just joining us now in person or online, we've been working our way through Matthew's gospel, his account of why Jesus' life is good news for all of us. And in that conversation, most recently, as far as like the timeline goes of the Jesus story, we're a few days before Jesus is arrested and tried and crucified and then resurrected. And in that time, there's different conversations that are happening. And if you read the Apostle John's story, another one of Jesus' close students, about what was happening during that time, he records an altogether different conversation of what's happening in an upper room over a meal, a Passover meal. And in Matthew's gospel, he centers on some different conversations that are happening with Jesus, with other people in the temple grounds around the Passover celebrations, and then with his students kind of in private as follow-up. And his students have just asked some kind of curious questions because as Jesus was talking, he made some weird statements. One about this temple in Jerusalem that had been standing for hundreds of years at this point. I mean, it was destroyed by Babylon like 586 BC-ish. And then it's been around, again, for over 400 years. It's pretty stable. And Jesus says, these blocks, they're going to be ripped apart again, stone from stone. And he also tells his followers, there's going to be times when, in the future, when you're really mistreated, some people will try to kill you or harm you or chase you out of your towns. And then he says, there's also a time when I'm going to come back to this temple, but I'm not going to come back until people's hearts have changed, till they're ready for me. And his followers are going, what? What are you talking about? When is this stuff going to happen? And he says, well, I'll answer your question when, but I'm going to tell you kind of what to expect. There's going to be these cycles of things, these seasons of things, kind of things that happen throughout history that we've seen happen over the last couple thousand years. People fighting wars. I mean, that's in the news today. And it was in the news in Jesus' time and a few decades afterwards. And people experiencing natural disasters. And he gives them kind of vague answers. And I mentioned that I think one of the reasons why he does is because he wants to focus them in on here and now. And I think he wants maybe us to focus on the same kinds of things, not to get so distracted with the times of these things that he's spoken about that we forget what's going on here and now. And so to kind of focus them in, he tells them, stay awake. And what he means by stay awake is stay focused on life here and now. And in order to kind of flesh that out and tell them what he means by that, he tells 3 stories called parables. We talked about parables a little bit last week. We'll do a recap in a second. But these parables, they're stories where Jesus pulls out these characters that people experience in everyday life in the first century. So we kind of have to do some imagination sometimes today because our culture is a little bit different. He'll tell these stories. Most of them have 2 or 3 characters. But you're supposed to get there's this underlying meaning behind it. And they tell you something about the way God's kingdom operates or something about who Jesus is and how his nature is, or something about like a decision that we're supposed to be confronted with that's maybe not natural, not human, how God's going to pull us out of our comfort zone and push us towards a decision that's better for us spiritually, but that's just totally not natural, doesn't come natural to us. And so there's some point behind it. But we mentioned in the past, too, with these parables, there could be a tendency for us to want to overanalyze them and say, well, the parable mentions this item and this item and this item, and I've heard about those in the Bible before, so surely they have some kind of hidden meaning, and we're attaching meaning to everything, somebody's shoe or some lamp or this or that. It's all going to have a meaning. And most of the time, that's not necessarily the intention behind the parable. It's to teach us some overarching principle, again, about God's kingdom and how it works or who Jesus is or something of that nature. So last week, we looked at a parable just for quick review. And it was a story about a master who he goes away for a period of time, and he has one slave that he puts in charge of feeding everybody in his household. And this slave is really consistent with that because slavery is just a part of the Roman world. It's part of culture. It doesn't mean God condones it. It's a story that's real life that some people are experiencing as slaves or as people who own slaves in this culture, and so it's relevant for them. They can imagine it. So one slave, he's in charge of feeding everybody in the household. All the master's relatives, extended family, kids, other slaves in the household, anybody attached to it. He's doing a great job. He's really consistent. And the master shows back up and says, you've done a great job. I'm going to give you access to even more of my possessions and more oversight and responsibility. Like, you've done an awesome job at this task. And then there's a contrast. And there's another slave that's mentioned in the parable. And Jesus kind of presents it as a what if. But imagine if the master comes back and he has a bad slave who maybe has a similar assignment, but instead of focusing on that, he starts hurting the other slaves in the household and the other family members. I mean, he's, like kicking them when they're down, or being verbally abusive, or physically harming them, or denying them their food, or, treating them unfairly. Some people show favoritism toward, and other people get neglected. If he sees that, and then on top of it, if this bad slave we try to put in charge of things, instead of spending his time going out, and eating and drinking with friends and getting intoxicated and just totally like dropping the ball, he's focused on just living for himself or herself. How's the master going to feel when he comes back and encounters that slave? And that's one of the ways Jesus describes what it means to stay awake. And it's like his point, we kind of talked about this last week in our discussion. His point at that point in time is that part of staying awake is focusing on this task, this job that the master's given us. We talked about how the master in that story probably is reflective of Jesus, because right before that in the context, Jesus presents himself as somebody who's going to come back. And that's been what the question was about in the first place. You said you were coming back one day to this temple in Jerusalem. When's it going to happen? And he said, someday, I'm coming back. And so this master in the story, oddly enough, is coming back at some point in time, a time when they don't know, a time that will catch them off guard. And that's the same kind of circumstances Jesus has been describing to his followers. I'll come back someday, but the time's going to catch you off guard. You won't expect it. And so if we see him as the master and us as the servants, which servant are we? Are we the one that finds some need that we have to meet in our household, or in our household of faith, which we might call our church community, or in our community in general, Apple Valley or Hurricane or Laverican or Tokerville or wherever on earth you might happen to be traveling from that you call home? Those are our communities. And this good servant, he just finds this need, and it's assigned to him by his master. Feed everybody consistently, feed them good food, make sure they're cared for. Do we have some consistent thing that we're doing, some consistent need of people that we're meeting consistently? And that seemed to be one way to stay awake. And that's a great focus. That's one thing we can do until then. Instead of just walking outside and staring at the sky all day and hoping, maybe today's the day, there are people that are hurting right around us. So what can we practically do to stay awake? Well, we can attach ourselves to some kind of need. And a lot of you have. A lot of you have found a need in this church, and you're meeting it. You're coming over to mow the lawn so that the people who are here during the week, and the homeschool groups that meet, and the recovery groups that meet, and the people that are here can have, a nice place, a nice grounds to use. Or maybe you're watching kids in the childcare, and that's a need. So some parents can have time to sit and listen when they're around a young infant or toddler 24/7, all the rest of their lives. Or you're plugged into this prayer team, and you're praying for needs because prayer works. You've seen it work in your life, and that God listens, and he's capable of doing things to answer that. And so that's the need that you've seen. Or it's something out in the community. And maybe you can merge those, where you're meeting one need within our church family, but you realize there's a way to spread this beyond this group to like the larger community. And that's where your passion's at. And then for some of you, you haven't really found that yet. Or maybe you had something at one point in time in your life, but it's just life's gotten busy, and you kind of gotten distracted and detached, or circumstances or busyness or whatever kind of have held you back recently. Maybe there's something out there that you can do to stay awake. That's this task that God has, put toward us. And then today we're going to look at a second story. And this is another aspect of staying awake. It's not focused on doing something at all. And then next week, we're going to look at the third story Jesus tells, and it's different from the other two as well. So today, it's titled Stay Awake Part 2, and Jesus is going to tell a story, and I think it's kind of a humorous story when you think about it and step back, and there's a lot of room for discussion, and a lot of questions I still honestly have about it, because the thing is with these stories, you can just talk about them for days or weeks or months or years, and you don't quite mine everything in the story. And you might discover something new a decade later. And so we're going to talk through some things, and I want to ask you some questions in real time as well, just to see your thoughts and your impressions about what the story is. So we're going to look at that today. A third thing that staying awake means. And I'm going to propose, based on the story, it might have something to do with being ready. But how are we supposed to be ready? There's a lot of ways to be ready. We'll have to get into the parable to discover a little bit more. I want to tell you as well, setting up for this parable is going to be filled with a lot of different common images that are found elsewhere in the Bible. We're going to hear about weddings in this parable. We're going to hear about lamps, We're going to hear about oil. We're going to hear about doors, about wise and foolish people, about a master. And you've probably seen these images or characters other places in the Bible. And maybe they're important for us to note, but maybe we shouldn't overanalyze them as well. Also, we're going to step into the Jewish culture. We know how weddings happen in our culture, and some of you, the interesting thing about weddings is different cultures, weddings happen differently even today. We had a wedding, a couple from India, with Indian culture that lived in California. They used our church for a wedding a couple years ago, and that was so different, right? Different aspects of the ceremony were so different than the type of wedding that my wife, Christine, and I had, for example. And so all of us, weddings are kind of cultural things, and maybe some similarities overlap. But in Jewish culture, here's a couple things to know going into the parable. First of all, this is the way things were then, and some of these things carry over today into Jewish tradition as well, and then they've added more traditions also since that point in time that Jesus is speaking into. But they kind of viewed the bride and the groom as the queen and the king for a day. And maybe we kind of have the same impressions, of like, you give the bride what she wants on her wedding day. But there was this, this view of, it's their royal day to be celebrated, and the bride is the queen and the groom is the king on his wedding day. And that's still kind of an aspect that filters over into Jewish culture today. Another thing, there's a couple different periods. First of all, there was a betrothal period, and at this point in time in history, people would still purchase wives. And so there was a betrothal, and by this point in time, some of that might have moved, phased out a little bit, but there was a contract that was made between the bride and the groom's families, and this groom would basically approach the bride's father, and there would be some kind of contract that was made. And at that point, contractually, they were married, so it was like engagement plus a little bit more, but they were considered married, but they weren't living together yet as family. And then there's a period of waiting, and then at some point in time, there was a ceremony. And before the ceremony, the groom would come to the bride's family's house and oftentimes put a veil over the bride's face, and then there would be friends that would gather, and there was a big procession that would lead from the bride's home to wherever this marriage ceremony would take place, and then they would have a ceremony and feasting that would last 3 to 7 days. And then at the end of that, the bride and the groom would move in together and would start, their home and their life and their family together from that point on. So that's kind of how things take place. And so we're going to hear about a procession, and that's just why that's going on, because it's a cultural detail that we need to be familiar with. Also, if you want to go on to the next page here, next slide on the presentation, we're going to read about lamps, and here's just a little visual for you. This is a Herodian-style oil lamp. In Jesus' time, these were used as lights, as flashlights to light your home. They're about the size of the palm of your hand. You can see in the next picture here what that's, size-wise, what we're looking at. And each of these lamps would hold enough olive oil. That's what they would burn, and they have a wick sometimes that they would slip into the smaller opening at the front of the lamp. They would burn for about 4 to 5 hours before they'd run out of oil. And then you can see a couple other pictures here. These are lamps that were excavated archaeologically in Israel. These are from a later time period than what Jesus is living in, but it gives you a gist. These are actually the molds that the lamps were made in. So the clay was put into the molds, and they're turned upside down. They just found them at this excavation site. You can go on to the next one as well. And that's what a mold looks like. So the clay would go down there, and that would make an impression for the bottom of the lamp with a spot for the handle. And then one more picture for you. These are more molds that were dug up. And so there's little workshops that would be set up to make these oil lamps. And olive oil was very accessible. Olive grows right across from Jerusalem. And so apparently, according to the story, some people would press the olive oil, and you could go buy olive oil from different people in the community who would sell it for you to burn as fuel in your lamps and use for food and all sorts of things. So that's sort of a little bit of cultural basis for us moving forward. And now we're going to step into the story. I think maybe for starters, let's see. I think I'm going to read it to you. And just sit back and listen and absorb, and then we'll talk about the parts of it and look at some questions. So here's the story. Jesus says, here's another story for you to tell you what it means to stay awake. At that time, which creates a question, what time? The kingdom of heaven, what's that? Talk about these things in a second. Will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the groom. We'll see how the story unfolds a little bit more. Virgins being 10, in this case, female girls, probably young girls who are going to be involved in the wedding procession. It doesn't dogmatically say. but culturally probably friends of the bride or the groom who are going to follow the couple out from the bride's house to where the ceremony is and be a part of the celebration, probably. It says 5 of them were foolish and 5 of them were wise. How so? It says when the foolish took their lamps, they didn't take oil with them. Now they had oil in the lamps. We'll see that in the story later on, but they didn't take any extra. But the wise ones took oil in their flasks, some kind of container, with them. When the groom was delayed, so this is speaking to that procession thing, groom's supposed to show up to get the bride, the parade happens to go over to where the marriage is going to happen, but something happens and he gets delayed. These young girls, a lot of times girls would get married in their early teens, as far as culturally at that point in time, and so perhaps these were young girls. Think of like preteens or early teenage girls, and staying awake, waiting for probably 4 or 5 hours, and we'll see that in another detail of the story in a second, and the groom doesn't show up, and he doesn't show up, and they do what all of us would do. They get drowsy. The literal word is that their heads start to bob. Have you ever had that happen before? I've been sitting on flights before and had some embarrassing interactions with people. I was really tired after driving one night, and I had a flight across the country when I was in college, and my best friend at the time was with me, sitting next to me, and as all best friends are, of course he's going to take an opportunity to make fun of me if it presents itself a little bit. And I was so exhausted that my head started to bob, and then this line of drool started to fall out of my mouth onto the little napkin that they give you to hold your packet of peanuts and your soda or whatever. And so he hit me right as I was about ready to drop that, and I guess I sucked it up in my mouth, and he just started laughing at me because I got drowsy, and that's what was happening. And these young girls are starting to nod off because it's been a long day. And then they fell asleep. It says in the middle of the night, at some point, there was this shout, "Here's the groom, come out to meet him." So they're looking and they see somebody approaching on the road. He's coming up the road. And so it says, then all the virgins got up and they prepared their lamps. The foolish ones said to the wise ones, "Give us some of your oil because our lamps are going out." You remember how long I said the lamps lasted? 4 to 5 hours, right? So they've been waiting a while. And the lamps are starting to go out because the oil's running dry, right? So the foolish ones said to the wise ones, "Give us some of your oil because our lamps are going out." And the wise ones answered, "No, there's not going to be enough for us and for you because we've still got a celebration ahead. We've got to walk along the road. We've got to go to this wedding ceremony and celebration to follow. We don't know how long it's going to go on for. I mean, the celebration is going to last for days, so we need what we have." They say, "Go instead to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves." And I was thinking, how realistic is this? Because it's the middle of the night. But is this even possible? But apparently in the story, that's what they do. It says when they'd gone to buy some, again, where you go to buy lamp oil in the middle of the night, I don't know. But apparently this has been a problem before. Other people's lamps have run out of oil in the middle of the night, so they know where to go. It says the groom arrived, and those who were ready went in with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. So the groom comes, they have this procession. Those who have enough oil, they jump in. The other ones have gone out to try to locate some and purchase some. They arrive at the wedding banquet where the ceremony and the feast is going to happen. And then everybody's in and the door's shut. It says, later the rest of the virgins, the other 5, also came and said, "Master, Master, open up for us." And he replied, "Truly, I tell you, I don't know you." This is odd. I don't know how this strikes you, but that's a strange end to the story. I see that and I'm like, this is just strange. Because why wouldn't you just open the door? And why would you make a statement like that? But then I have to step back and remember, this is a parable. It's a story and Jesus has some point that he's driving at. So we got to step back and then walk through the story again and try to figure out what is he trying to tell us about how God's kingdom or he or some decision we need to make operates. What's the big picture of this? So we're going to walk back through that for just a few moments now. So this is how the story begins, walking back to the beginning. It says, at that time. And there's already a context that's set for this. There's already been questions that have brought us to this point. And the time that Jesus has been talking about over and over again and that his followers asked him about is, when are you coming back? So the time is the time of his return. in context. So at that time, the time when Jesus says, someday I'm going to return, he says the kingdom of heaven will be like. And the kingdom of heaven, a lot of us have different things in mind when we think of kingdoms. Like, I tend to think of a place, like you go to the kingdom of, here or there. Think of a country or like a physical place that's got a castle or something, right? And when the Bible talks about kingdom, it's talking about the people, not the place. In almost every instance, Old Testament, New Testament, the idea of kingdom is not the place, it's people. And so these are people who are allowing God to be king or God to rule in their lives. So he's saying this story is going to teach you about something about people who are allowing God to rule in their lives. And maybe about people who aren't allowing God to rule in their lives. You're going to get that kind of point from this. It's going to teach you something by the end when all this is said and done. There's some point about how people who are allowing God to rule in their lives operate. And maybe that has something to do with staying awake, another aspect of staying awake. So that it reveals something about these types of people who let God rule at the time when Jesus will return. And now he tells a story. They're going to be like, so it's a comparison story, 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the groom. 5 of them were foolish, and that can mean anything from like ill-fated to like naive to prone to poor decision-making, careless, negligent, all those kind of synonyms. Living in the moment. 5 are that. And then 5 are wise. They're people who are thinking ahead. They're making smart decisions, kind of being analytical or thoughtful or cautious or logical or reasonable or prepared. Those kinds of things. So 2 different approaches by these 2 different groups of girls. 10 in the Bible is a number that kind of symbolizes like a complete group. And so maybe Jesus is saying like, there's this complete group, some complete group. But there's 5 who are this way, 5 who are this way. And we talk about characters in parables. And this introduces us to some characters. If I asked you, who do you think the characters are in this parable? How would you answer? What do you think? Like, what do you think? The virgins? Okay. Any other thoughts? Who are the main characters? The groom? I think groom's definitely one, yeah. Mm-hmm. The bride? See, that's the weird thing. The bride isn't mentioned in the story. She's not here. And I don't know why. Maybe you know why. And when you figure it out, you can come tell me. But I thought that was an odd thing, right? I would almost assume these girls are like the bride's friends, but I don't know. At least they know the groom somehow, it seems like, or don't know him or whatever based on the end of the story. But yeah, there's the bride. Where is she? We assume she's a part of all this because it's hard to get married if there's not one. Some people might even speculate, well, like all these virgins are considered the bride. I think it's probably taking things out a little context a little bit far. Where's the bride? I don't know, but she seems to not be that like. What do you think?
She's still getting dressed.
He said she's still getting dressed. Yeah, I don't know. It can be a process, these weddings, whether you're the bride or the groom, because the groom's the guy that's 4 hours late. So, I mean, all around, it's been a rough experience for everyone. So, but I think it's interesting the bride's not a part of it in the story. And maybe that's because she's not what we're supposed to focus on. So maybe there's something else. And it seems like the 10 virgins who are accompanying them and celebrating as friends, that seems to be our focus. But I also think maybe we can separate the 10 virgins into 2 groups, right? For characters, because they operate differently. We've got the 5 who are the wise ones and the 5 who are called the foolish ones. So maybe we have 3 characters: the groom, the foolish virgin girls, and the wise virgin girls who are part of this procession and friends of the bride and groom. So maybe those are our characters that we're dealing with. And in these parables, characters, they represent a lot of times something or someone else. Just shooting from the hip at this point in our conversation, do you have any ideas about who you think those characters represent? Let's start with the groom. Any thoughts about who the groom might represent in this story? Again, there's some teaching about the kingdom of heaven that we're supposed to get. So what are your thoughts? The Lord, I heard. Any other thoughts? It gets tricky sometimes because in the last parable, or a couple parables ago, the thief ended up being Jesus. So it doesn't always align with what you would think. So maybe the Lord. Let's talk about the virgin girl. We'll come back to this at the very end. What about the 5 wise girls? Any ideas there yet? Believers, maybe. It's a good thought. Any other thoughts on them? Yeah. Survivors, okay. What about the 5 foolish ones? What do you think about that? Any thoughts yet? And we may not have ideas, like clearer ideas till we get done with the whole discussion, but any other thoughts on that?
Non-believers.
Okay, you're going to say just the opposite, right? Non-believers or people who didn't survive, or however we term that, maybe? Yeah.
They're more worldly.
More worldly people? I don't know. What?
In the moment.
In the moment people? Yeah. Undecided people? Yeah. All these are, really interesting thoughts. And so again, let's talk further and try to wade through this and figure out a couple things as we go along. I think another interesting question to think about ultimately is how are they foolish and how are they wise? And we'll kind of come back to that in the end after we've read on. Here's how the story continues, verse 3. It says, when the foolish took their lamps, they didn't take oil with them, but the wise ones took oil in their flasks with their lamps. I just want to camp out here for just a moment. It seems to really be focusing our attention in on that fact. And I just want to ask the question, why? Why do you think that 5 of these young girls just brought the lamps with one, no refills, right? One oil lamp. And then there were 5 other girls. Again, these are probably like, 10 to 14, 10 to 16-year-old girls probably contextually in the story. The other ones are like, I think I need a refill. Why? Why? Any thoughts on that? Why would some of them, have more? Some of them be like, oh, it's good enough. Yeah.
I think some of them knew the groom and knew that he would be late.
That's an interesting thought. Okay. He said, I think some of them knew the groom and they knew that he would be late. Maybe. It's possible. Yeah. Okay, had experience with wedding celebrations and realized these things can go on for a while. And if you've been to weddings, in our culture, some of them are quite lengthy, right? And other ones might just have not, they didn't realize. Yeah.
Oil often in the scripture represents the Holy Spirit.
Okay.
So the foolish ones were not really living, according to the Holy Spirit. Other 5 were really trusting in God. Their faith was strong, and they were really trusting in the Holy Spirit's guidance and
Okay.
strength.
Okay, so this comment was maybe oil is reflective of something deeper, the Holy Spirit. So it's supposed to symbolize something. And that's where it gets tricky, because if we overanalyze parables, we get into tricky waters. And yet sometimes there are things that have significant meaning. So this is something to maybe keep on the back burner and realize maybe there's significance or maybe there's not. The Holy Spirit is used, synonymously with oil, like the lights inside of the tabernacle and the temple in the Old Testament. And so maybe there's some connection there as well to keep aware of. But yeah, this conversation of why? Because it's interesting that some of them are like, I need this. I need to be prepared. Whether it's for whatever reasons, the ones that you mentioned, or other reasons. And then there's other ones that are just like, I think I'm good with what I've got. But that's interesting. Again, we're going to come back to that, back around to it in a moment. So it says in verse 5, when the groom was delayed, they all became drowsy and fell asleep. And I think this is interesting too, because all of the girls, the wise ones and the foolish ones in the story, everybody falls asleep. And they fall asleep while they're waiting. And if the groom in this story, is representative of Jesus in some ways, and we're supposed to connect this with the time of his return, I think that's just a reality that we face. And maybe this is something we should consider personally. It's hard to wait. It's hard to wait for a lot of things, and we get tired of waiting. And when we get tired of waiting, sometimes we just lose focus and we lose attention and we fall asleep and we forget what we're about, or we just get tired of going on. And that's a reality that we all face and have to contend with. And whatever that looks like for us, it might look different for you than it does for me. It's hard to wait on anything, and it's hard to wait on Jesus as well. Sometimes we just lose focus and we get tired of trying to wait for him or live for him. And so that's a reality, I think, that we face too. It says in the middle of the night, there was a shout. So everybody's falling asleep, and all of a sudden this loud noise, it wakes everybody up. Hey, groom's finally here. He's 4 hours late, but he's finally here. He's coming out on the road. We can see him out in the distance. So, and then the instruction to all these girls and everybody else presumably in the household is, come out to meet him. It's time for the procession. Come out to meet him. And so all of them get up and they prepare their lamps. Some versions say they trim their lamps, but the word's just really they prepare them. So they've got to refill them with oil, maybe trim the wick up a little bit. They're going out finally in the dark. And the foolish ones are like, oh no, my lamp's out of oil, like it's almost out. So they say to the wise ones, give us some of your oil. Our lamps are going out. And the wise ones say, no, we can't do that because we won't have enough for both of us. So why don't you go out and buy some for yourselves? And I mean, these are points to camp out on and why parables can be discussed for like weeks and years and months, because you're like, is there some meaning to that? Like, why? Why didn't they just share a little bit of oil? What was so important about that? Or maybe it's just part of the story, so just go along for the ride. I don't know. We don't have time to discuss those kinds of like rabbit trails and possibilities, but maybe there's something in there for us as well, or maybe not. But for whatever reason, they just say, if you want oil, you go out and buy it, because we need this. So suddenly they realize the groom is arriving, and everyone's caught off guard. It says when they'd gone to buy some, the ones who didn't have enough, didn't have a second refill, the groom arrived, and those who were ready went in with him. And so that's why I termed this like topic, readiness is a part of staying awake. Because whatever we're supposed to get from this, it has something to do with another way to be ready. Different way than the last story we talked about last week. They go in with him. So first they have the procession, and then they get to the place where the wedding's going to be held, and then they go in with the groom, and the door gets shut. Why does the door get shut? I mean, it seems like there'd be people coming and going from this celebration. At our wedding reception, we kept the door open, actually, because there were so many people coming and going, and I don't know, maybe it's a cultural thing, or maybe it just is supposed to make a point to us, but there's some kind of finality, at least in the story Jesus is telling. The door gets shut. So 5 of them, they get to rejoice. They got to join in the procession. They get to see the wedding ceremony. They get to be a part of the celebration that's going to last for days afterwards. They're there. They're celebrating. And later it says in verse 11, the rest of the virgins also came, the 5 girls that were out buying oil, looking for it in the middle of the night, and they said, Master, Master, open up for us. And they're going to miss out because they're knocking, but the door's already been shut. And because we read the story at the beginning of our discussion, we know how the master responded, who's presumably the groom in this story, although that's kind of hazy as well. Open up for us. And so what's interesting here, this brings up a lot of questions on my part. I look at this and I'm thinking several things, these, kind of the big overview is that these other 5 girls, they're not really prepared. They don't maybe have the right priorities. And then at the very last minute when they realize the groom's about to show up, they try to readjust their priorities super fast. We've got to get the oil because we need the oil for some reason. Let's get everything in order right at the last second. And while they're trying to get everything in order and scrambling around, putting things in the order that they think they need to be in for the night to happen, they get left out of all the fun. The procession, the wedding ceremony, the door gets shut. They don't get to enjoy the celebration. So they just miss out because they're trying to, reorganize all their priorities right at the last second. It's not working for them. And I'm wondering, what should their priorities even be? And it seems like their priority was definitely, I need oil, but this is something I wrestle with, and maybe you have some ideas too. Why not just go to the wedding without your lamp? What do you think? I don't know if I have a great answer for that, but you have to weigh things here, right? Why didn't they just, what was the priority in the moment? What was their priority? It seemed to be getting oil, but why didn't they just go? Maybe I don't know enough about culture to answer that either, but what do you think? Yeah.
Jesus started out this whole thing with, be ready for I am coming.
Okay.
I think this is a parable explaining that the lamp is their soul, and they are not ready for Jesus to let them in the door. He told us the door is narrow.
Okay.
I am the way. Like without the oil, in other words, without paying attention to your soul, you're not getting in.
Okay, let me recap that. So what was shared just a moment ago was that possibly the lamp is indicative of somebody's soul, and having the Holy Spirit or not having the Holy Spirit, being in a right condition with God, not being in a right condition with God. And so maybe we're supposed to take something like that from the story. And so we're supposed to get that, somebody's soul just wasn't ready because this whole context has been about readiness. So it's an interesting thought, maybe. Any other thoughts about why didn't they just go?
I think it's a representation in today's world as it was at that point in time. In a sense, a group of people, be it 10 or more, you're going to have some that are going to be prepared, have it all right, and you have some at the other end, who don't have an idea.
Okay, so maybe just, to give us a contrast. Some people were ready, and then there were other people that were just, they didn't have an idea of what was going on. Yeah. So, this creates questions. I'll take one more, and then we'll
No, I was just going to
wrap up here soon.
The five realized the importance of the event. That was more important than the rest of it.
Yeah,
The five didn't realize the importance of it until
that's
that moment.
good as well, I think.
What she said and what
Yeah, so this comment was that 5 people realized ahead of time how important this event was, right? And so that's why they were prepared. And so there's some kind of a disconnect in the other 5 about how important this event really is, right? Because and then at the last minute they realized, oh, this really was an important event or something like that maybe. But initially they kind of thought, oh, this is it's an event, but maybe it's not that important of an event. And that pushes me on toward this last comment because I think, maybe there's something to different aspects of what have been shared, but as far as to that, they really didn't see it as that important of an event. Then I would go the next step and say, well, why didn't they consider it as an important event? And maybe, possibly, it has something to do with this last statement that we see here. I think this is a really weird reply at the end. I mean, these are young girls. They just forgot to get oil for their lamp. They got sidetracked. And yet, the master won't let them in. But the weird thing is the last statement. Truly, I don't know you. I don't know you at all. I don't know you. I read a story about a couple in Texas that got married, and they had some people who showed up at their reception, and the bride just couldn't pinpoint who these people were. And over time, the lady of the couple that came that she didn't recognize started drinking a little bit too much and, acting kind of inappropriately. And she's like, this is just really weird. So she spent about half an hour walking around to her in-law side of the family and saying who is this? Are they related to you? Because we didn't invite them from our side. And after about 30 minutes, nobody could hit the nail on the head and figure out who they were. Nobody could nail it down. And so her and the groom, the bride and the groom actually approached this couple and said, we just, tell us a little bit more, about you. Who are you? And as they were talking, they made this weird comment, and what they did was they basically threatened the groom and said, if you ever do anything to hurt this girl, we'll come for you. And this is so confusing because this couple doesn't even know who these people are. And at that point, the bride was like, we really don't know them, because the groom had been at her side through 3 different surgeries. He had agreed to move to London so she could pursue a master's degree and done many other very selfless things in their relationship to put her first. And she was like, anyone who knows me would never have made those comments about, threatening me, because they know this guy cares for me. They wouldn't have threatened him. They can't. And so she talked to the wedding planner. She's like, can you figure out who this is? And the wedding planner approached them and finally figured out these were neighbors. But apparently neighbors who didn't know them at all. And so shortly thereafter, the mother of the bride and the local sheriff came and escorted them out of the wedding. But the point being, these people were at the wedding, they were crashing it, but they didn't know the bride and groom, obviously. And as time went on, this could be told. And it seems like the same kind of an ending to this story as well, where these are friends, right? They feel like they're friends, they're claiming to be friends, but when it comes down to actually knowing the groom at least, and again, we don't know the bride's not in the story, but at least when it comes to knowing the groom, the shocking reality is that half of these people that are headed to the wedding, they don't really even have a relationship with the groom. Like he says, I don't know you, and that can be interpreted a couple different ways. It could be, I don't know anything about you, like you're those friends of, friends of friends who were kind of with us, but we really have never had any conversations. We don't know anything about you. Like, who are you? Maybe you knew the other 5 that are in here with us, but you certainly didn't know us. And then the other, like a nuance of that word in the New Testament can be like, we don't really have an affection, again, because we haven't established a friendship. So you say you're our friends, you were headed out to the wedding, but we really never knew each other at all. Like we didn't have a basis of friendship. I don't know anything about you. And maybe that's why they weren't prepared in the first place, because they weren't motivated because it wasn't a close relationship. When you go to a wedding and you're going to a friend's wedding that you know and you care about, you're prepared. Maybe you go out and you buy a gift for them, right? Or you make sure you're on time to the wedding. But if you're just going to crash the party, get a free meal with somebody, you really don't care about those things. And maybe that's the state of the foolish 5 instead of the wise 5. And it seems like that's where Jesus is leaving us at the end of the story. He's talking about staying awake, not in terms of being committed to a task like last week's story, but in terms of being committed to a person and actually cultivating a relationship with a person. Maybe he would say staying awake is getting to know him, being Jesus, cultivating a friendship with him. And maybe the reason why people misplace their priorities, or will not be ready, is because there's just never been any attention given to knowing about him or to trying to know him and develop that affectionate relationship. So maybe that's how we stay awake, is through growing in friendship with Jesus. So just something to think about as we wrap things up today. I know I've let our discussion go on for a while, so we'll go ahead and close in prayer today. But hopefully this is just the springboard of a conversation. And maybe you saw things that we didn't ever talk about today that you think, that's something to that. Maybe there is. So talk to each other, have conversations, and follow up. Try to figure out maybe there's more to this than just what we talked about today.